I've introduced you to all the basic players. I've introduced you to all the basic players. Now we need to start looking at the pathways, and I like to start with the easiest pathway first, and that's the vestibulocerebellar pathway. That's where we're going to start. Okay? And this is going to be my basic, this is a frontal section, right? So here's my cortical region, so I can just say cortex. Does anybody remember what these guys are? This paranuclei? Yeah, it's your thalamus. One's a thalamus, two's a thalami. Okay, looking at, this is going to be my cerebellum. Okay, and then I'm going to do a lot of labeling on this side. I'm going to draw the actual pathways on this side. So this is going to be my superior. This is going to be my middle, my inferior. They're all cerebellar peduncles. Okay. Well, nothing to label and everything. Okay. And when we think about the vestibulocerebellum, does anybody remember the name of the lobe that's associated with the vestibular system? That would be your flocculonodular lobe. Okay. And I'm going to draw it here. You really can't see it behind the brainstem, but I'm going to make it visible. So it's this red thing here, okay, on one side, and it's going to be on the other side, okay? So this is nothing more than your flocculonodular lobe. Flocculonodular lobe was associated with a deep cerebellar nucleus. Does anybody remember the deep cerebellar nucleus? It's going to be bilateral, so it's going to be your fastigial. It's your fastigial nucleus. We also have to remember our Purkinje cell. Make the Purkinje cell just a little bit different color so you can see it clearly. But your Purkinje cell is going to exist here. And this is just one Purkinje cell out of thousands. Realize that. So you have the cell that's here, and then it's going to already synapse and be hooked up with this fastigial nucleus. So here is my Purkinje cell. Just drawing the players, and there's only one more player for the vestibulocerebellar pathway, and that's going to be this nucleus right here. You'll learn it's kind of at the base of the pons, and draw it kind of the same every time. This is going to be your vestibular nucleus, and coming out of that is your vestibulospinal tract. Your vestibular nucleus, and then here's your vestibulospinal tract. Okay, vestibulospinal tract has to do with what? What does it innervate? Postural extensors.
That's the one, like, if you sit somebody up, they can go and activate. That's that one. If they're
Yep.
awake.
But once the vestibular system activates, it activates your postural extensors. Okay, now the vestibular nucleus, we haven't really talked that much about where it receives this information yet, but it receives it from your inner ear. Your vestibular system actually resides inside your inner ear. So I'm just going to represent, here's a bunch of ears. There's a pair of ears. There's one ear here, and then another ear here. Okay, and in your inner ear, there's 3 different semicircular canals, so this is just going to represent bilateral vestibular system. Okay, and when we get into the cranial nerve, you're going to find out the vestibular system is innervated by your 8th cranial nerve, and the 8th cranial nerve just comes in, and it's going to relay information to the vestibular nucleus, specifically about where your head is in 3-dimensional space, and head movement, and all that other good stuff. So once the vestibular system gets activated, it relays that information to the vestibular nucleus. Yes?
Does that synapse, is that going through the midbrain, or is it actually just coming?
It's hard to represent. It's coming through the skull and then right into the brainstem. I can't show that really here, but yeah, no, it's not. It's just trying to show that it's connected to the nucleus. That's where the information is coming. We'll talk more about that later. Any other questions? So I see what's happening here. So I'm just going to connect the pieces. So coming out of the vestibular nucleus, specifically traveling through the inferior cerebellar peduncle, you're going to have essentially a mossy fiber coming in, right? And it's going to synapse with the Purkinje cell. Okay. That Purkinje cell was already hooked up to its vestigial nucleus, and it's so important to know where the brain is in 3-dimensional space, or where the head is in 3-dimensional space, that vestigial nucleus is going to create a feedback loop. So it's going to send out an axon that also goes through the inferior cerebellar peduncle and synapses again with the vestibular nucleus. I think that's the simplest of the 3 pathways. Vestibular nucleus sends out an axon, connects with its Purkinje cell in the floccular nodular lobe, vestibular cerebellum. That Purkinje cell is hooked up with its deep cerebellar nucleus, vestigial. That vestigial nucleus then sends out an axon that reconnects with the vestibular nucleus. Okay, because it's really important to know where your head is in 3-dimensional space. And a lot of important things. So you stand up, you're going to activate the system, and you're going to stimulate your postural extensor muscles. Question? Is there a question? No? Yes, Jeff?
So is that connection between the Purkinje cell and the vestibular nucleus, does that have like a name, or is it just a part of the vestibular spinal tract? Or?
So this is actually in the cerebellum proper. If you can imagine, I'm trying to really make it simple to see, but if you can imagine, there are thousands of Purkinje cells all throughout this vestibular. They are all connected to the vestigial nucleus. Okay, so it's not a specific tract. There's just a lot of axons. I mean, it's very white. It looks like a massive tree limbs and branches everywhere when you look at it under a microscope. Okay, so it's nothing. There's no specific tract or anything like that because they're everywhere. Okay, a lot more to it. This is what you need to know. Any other questions? Does everybody see that one? Yep. Did you have another question?
Yeah, like I feel like an injury or damage, like something hit like here, that kind of messes with your vestibular system. Is that like because it's just closer to the brainstem?
Lots of stuff messes with your vestibular system. We'll talk more about that when we get to the vestibular portion of the course. There's a lot of stuff there. So, okay, moving on. That's vestibular cerebellar. I really feel like that's the simplest one. Let's move on to the next easiest one. I think is going to be your dorsal or posterior spinal cerebellar pathway. Hopefully, the drawing is pretty similar up top. The only thing I've added here is this transverse section of the spinal cord, but hopefully that looks pretty familiar to you right now. What I'd like to do is go ahead and put in all the players. So here's your thalamus. Thalamus didn't have any job in the last pathway, but it's going to have some jobs in this pathway. Okay, and then your superior, middle, and inferior. You're under your cerebellar peduncles. talked about, I think I used this color. So we had to define our vermal area to be most in the middle. It's going to be your vermis. And associated, the deep cerebellar nucleus is associated with the vermal area. It's going to be your vestigial nucleus. We'll draw that in there. Okay, just on the outside of the vermal area, or the vermis, it's going to be your paravermal area. Does anybody remember the name of the nuclei that are associated with the paravermal area? It would be your interposed, good, interposed nuclei. Okay, so we've got our vermal area, our paravermal area. Remember, vermal area is going to be associated with non-conscious proprioception coming from the trunk, and paravermal is non-conscious proprioception coming from extremities. Okay. And each of these areas should have a Purkinje cell. So we'll draw a Purkinje cell in here for the paravermal area, and that's going to be hooked up with the interposed nuclei. And then we can draw a Purkinje cell here for the paravermal area. I'm sorry, for the vermal area. So paravermal, Purkinje cell, vermal, Purkinje cell. That's going to be hooked up to your vestigial nucleus. Okay, everybody see where we are? Okay, another thing that's going to be important here is going to be a marker that we saw for the midbrain previously. It's going to be your red nucleus. And you know that your red nucleus sends out axons that decusate immediately and then come straight on down for your rubrospinal tract. Previously, we saw the rubrospinal tract was associated with upper extremity flexion in humans. It's also associated with muscle tone, like having an increased muscle tone. If you think back to the video we started with, did you see how she wasn't super toned? Looked like she hadn't lifted weights ever, right? So she's kind of almost like the Michelin Manny kind of presentation. Okay, that means that she has an issue with her muscle tone, which is all part of vestibular issues. Balance, coordination, muscle tone, three things associated with vestibular or cerebellar problems. Okay, and then the last player that we need to look at, and I think I've done this in, let's do it this color here. There's also this thing called the reticular formation that we've seen previously, and I'll put it on this side, sort of like a nondescript bunch of nuclei here. And that's your reticulospinal tract. Red nucleus with your red, and there's your reticulo. Coming out of the reticular formation. So nothing new so far. And we have seen previously the position in the spinal cord for the dorsal spinal cerebellar tract is going to be here. It's going to be more dorsal. Overall, it's going to be part of the lateral column system. Okay, and that's just your dorsal spinal cerebellar. Okay, and that's where this information is going to travel. so I think everything that's up there so far we've seen before. Now for some new stuff. What happened is there's first order somatosensory neuron here that's going to carry non-conscious proprioception from both the trunk and the extremities. Okay, so in general, just non-conscious proprioception information coming from the trunk and extremities travels through this somatosensory neuron. Okay, that somatosensory neuron then synapses here in the dorsal gray horn. Okay. It's going to synapse, let's see, I'm going to make this color. It's going to synapse on a special nucleus, or a nucleus with a special name. And the name of this nucleus is Clark's nucleus. So it's C-L-A-R-K-E-S. Clark's nucleus. And that's nothing more than the name of the nucleus and the dorsal gray horn, where the dorsal spinocerebellar tract information coming in synapses right away. Okay, synapses on something called Clark's nucleus. Once it synapses on Clark's nucleus, then Clark's nucleus sends out an axon. Do you have a question? No? Okay. Clark's nucleus sends out an axon that stays ipsilateral, travels up the spinal cord through the dorsal spinocerebellar tract, and comes in through the inferior cerebellar peduncle. Information destined or coming from the trunk synapses with the Purkinje cell associated with the dermis. And but information destined or coming from the extremities synapses with the Purkinje cell in the paradermal area. Yep.
Sorry, just backtracking. The Purkinje cells, they're just kind of collecting information to send to that deep cerebellar nucleus. Okay.
Yep. Purkinje cells are responsible for collecting all that afferent information coming in from the environment. In this particular case, we're looking at non-conscious proprioception from the trunk and the extremities. Ben?
That axon from Clark's nucleus, does it split anything to separately, or just pass through one?
So I'm just probably oversimplifying it. So information coming in, information coming out of the information coming out of Clark's nucleus is just traveling. What you need to know is it's traveling up the track. If the information came from trunk, it goes to trunk. If the information came from extremities, it goes to extremities. Probably the most important thing to note is that everything stays ipsilaterally. There's no decussations like there was for cortical regions. Right? Everything so far for the dorsal spinal cerebellar tract is going to stay ipsilateral. Okay. Now, as far as the information coming from the trunk, goes to its Purkinje cell, delivers its information to vestigial nucleus. That vestigial nucleus is then going to send out an axon that mostly efferent information travels through the superior cerebellar peduncle and synapses with ipsilateral reticulospinal tract. Yeah, reticulospinal is coming from the reticular formation. Remember, that's going to stimulate postural extensors. So it's going to stimulate your trunk muscles. Information from the trunk muscles. Okay. Then the interposed nuclei are going to send out two different axons. Okay. One is going to go through the superior cerebellar peduncle and synapse with the contralateral red nucleus. And then another going to, and that affects muscle tone. And then another is going to come out through the superior cerebellar peduncle and synapse with a nucleus in the thalamus. You don't have to know which nucleus, just a nucleus in the thalamus. It's relaying information back up to the cortex. So this is somatosensory information, so we're going through the thalamus, right? And it's going to relay, the thalamus, the thalamic nucleus, is then going to relay information up to the cortical region. Does anybody remember the names of the regions of the brain involved in motor planning?
Premotor?
Yeah, so yeah, your supplementary motor area and your premotor cortex. So the axon that comes out of the thalamic nucleus delivers information to the supplementary motor area and premotor cortex. Okay, and that's how your brain is aware, non-consciously, is constantly being fed information from the cerebellum about the location of your extremities and trunk in three-dimensional space. Questions? Everything's ipsilateral. Do you have a question?
Yes, when you're like asleep, is that for like reticular?
The reticular formation, no, the reticular formation is, it helps to regulate sleep-wake cycles, but it's involved in postural extension. The reticulospinal tract is involved in stimulating postural extensors.
So when you're in bed or whatever, you kind of like twitch or whatever, is that kind of like?
I don't know. It's not the same. No, it's a little bit different. Any other questions? Yes, Neil?
So does the axon coming off of the vestigial and the nucleus, does that actually say what
No, it stays ipsilateral. The only off of the vestigial nucleus, everything is ipsilateral. Off of the interposed nucleus, everything goes contralateral. Yes.
The one coming off the vestigial nucleus and going to the reticulospinal tract, is that like afferent or afferent?
So anything coming off of these deep cerebellar nuclei is considered efferent because it's leaving the cerebellum. Okay, so these are all your efferent axons coming out. Okay. Any other questions? Okay, this was the easier of the two. The good news is that all the players for this pathway are identical to the ventral spinal cerebellar pathway. So I'm just going to go ahead, and the only thing that's going to be different is the location of the tracks. Okay, so if you just want to quickly go through, and we'll label everything again using this. So here's your thalamus. This time we can put in the nucleus. So there's going to be a thalamic nucleus involved. Okay. There's going to be your rubrospinal tract, so you're going to have your red nucleus. Sends out an axon decussate in the midbrain and travels all the way down. You're going to have your reticular formation here. Sends out an axon, goes all the way down. So here's your vermal region. And its deep cerebellar nucleus is going to be your vestigial nucleus. Here's your paravermal region. And its deep cerebellar nucleus is going to be your interposed nucleus. No changes. And here in the vermal region we have our Purkinje cell that's hooked up to the vestigial nucleus. And then in the paravermal region we have another Purkinje cell that's hooked up to our deep cerebellar nucleus. This is your reticular formation. Okay, and then up here we still have in the area of the cortex, we have area involved in motor planning. Again, we want to be aware of where our extremities and trunk are starting three-dimensional space before we can actually plan the movement. And the peduncles are all the same, so you've got your superior, middle, and inferior cerebellar peduncles. Okay. And really the only difference as far as players are concerned is the location of the tract. Remember that that ventral spinal cerebellar tract is going to be just a little bit ventral to the dorsal spinal cerebellar tract. Okay. Got it? Nothing different than the last pathway yet, but there is a big difference between the dorsal and ventral spinal cerebellar pathways, but really just one. And it starts out at the level of the spinal cord and the ascension. So we have your, in the, let's make it this color, you have your pseudopolar cell body neuron here. This is going to be receiving information about non-conscious proprioception from both the trunk and extremities again. Okay, so same as before. Non-conscious, unconscious proprioception from trunk and extremities. But this time we're going to travel through the ventral spinal cerebellar tract. So what happens is that that axon comes in and it synapses in the dorsal gray horn again. Okay, but this time it doesn't synapse on any particular nucleus. It doesn't really have a name. It's just a nucleus. And this nucleus it synapses with doesn't stay ipsilateral. It decussates to the opposite side. Okay, no specific name for that decussation, no specific name for the nucleus, but the ventral spinal cerebellar tract comes in and that neuron decussates to the opposite side, travels up the ventral spinal cerebellar tract, goes all the way up and enters the cerebellum through the superior cerebellar peduncle. Okay, so now we're contralateral, but remember all information for the cerebellum, any kind of injury, anything that happens is going to present ipsilaterally, so somehow we got to get back to the other side. What it does is this axon actually sneaks behind the brainstem, so I'm just going to represent it coming across this way. So it sneaks behind the brainstem, it's already in the cerebellum, and then it synapses with our information specific to trunk musculature. It's going to synapse in the vermal area, and then information specific for extremity information is going to synapse in the perivermal area. And that is the only difference between those two pathways. Okay, just in fact that once it synapses in the dorsal gray horn, it synapses, it decusates right away to the opposite side, travels all the way up the ventral spinocerebellar tract, and enters the cerebellum in the superior cerebellar peduncle, sneaks around behind the brainstem, and then goes to the opposite side. Okay. Everything else is exactly the same. So what you'd expect then is this vestigial nucleus, again, is going to send out axons, efferent information through the superior cerebellar peduncle, come down and synapse with reticular formation. We saw that in the last pathway, no change here. The information coming from the interposed nucleus, they send out axons. This nucleus sends out axons that travel through the superior cerebellar peduncle, synapse with the red nucleus, and also that thalamic nucleus is contralateral. And then that thalamic nucleus is contralateral is going to send out axons that synapse with the supplementary motor and premotor cortex. The rest of the pathway is the same. All the players are the same. Once you get to the deep cerebellar nuclei, the two pathways are identical. The only difference is that the dorsal spinal cerebellar pathway stays ipsilateral the entire time, and the ventral spinal cerebellar pathway decusates but then comes back to the same side. So it's all ipsilateral. You're wondering why. I have no idea. The only thing I could come up with, I thought about it before, is that information is so important that if one side of the spinal cord is damaged, you still have it coming up the other side. Was that going to be a question?
Yeah, I was just going to, so it's pretty much the same information traveling in two separate tracks.
Same information traveling in two separate tracks. One's traveling ipsilateral, the other's contralateral. So it's just really important to know where your body is in three-dimensional space, because it's non-conscious proprioception. It's just feedback information. You really need that information to function. Okay? What else? Okay, that's the hardest one we're going to do. So that's the hard one for today. And now moving on, we can look at the last pathway. Is going to be your cerebrocerebellar pathway. And this is the one where you're thinking about thinking. And I promise this one isn't so bad. It's pretty straightforward. All your standard players. So you're going to have your thalamus here. Okay, so your superior, it's going to be a little bit middle and inferior cerebellar peduncles. Okay, and I think I did purple for this. I did the lateral before. And your lateral hemispheres, remember, are going to be on the outside. That's your cerebrocerebellar area. And what was the name of the nucleus associated with your lateral hemispheres? Anybody remember? Dentate. Dentate, like dentures, teeth. Looks like a set of teeth, half a set of teeth. There's your dentate nucleus. Okay, there's going to be one on the other side too. We're going to stick to one side. Okay. Another thing I'll do is I'll even put a midline in here so you can see something funky is going to happen. Okay, all I did is just label a couple of dots down the middle, so we want to see some pathways. Up here in the cortical region, we still have our SMA and PMC, only this time it's a conscious thought to move. Okay, so you're thinking about moving, right? So thinking about moving. The motor planning area is thinking about moving. Here's your dentate nucleus. We need this Purkinje cell here. Here's your Purkinje cell hooked up with your dentate nucleus. Okay, and your lateral hemisphere. So we've got this thought about moving. And what happens is the thought about moving actually comes down in synapses with a bunch of nuclei in the pons. And they're just nonspecific nuclei in the pons. They're called pontine nuclei. So Pontine nuclei. And these are just a bunch of nuclei in the pons that are very specific for this pathway. So you're thinking about moving, and neural cell bodies from SMA, PMC send out axons that are going to travel down same side, synapse ipsilaterally with the pontine nuclei. Okay, those pontine nuclei are then going to send out axons, and this is the first time we're going to see this through the middle. They're going to send out axons that travel through the middle cerebellar peduncle. Okay, those axons come down and make contact with the Purkinje cell. Remember that Purkinje cell has all the information about what's going on everywhere else. And then the dentate nucleus sends out axons that go through the superior cerebellar peduncle, and they're actually going to synapse with a nucleus in the contralateral thalamus. And that nucleus is going to send out information back to the SMA and PMC saying, yes, good move, or no, it's not good move. Okay, and that's the only one that's conscious. So you're thinking about moving. It's your motor planning. Motor planning, thinking about it. Questions. So 3 different pathways. Vestibulocerebellar is involved in balance. Main players would be your vestigial nucleus, associated with floccular nodular lobe or vestibulocerebellum, as well as your vestibular nucleus. Okay, information just makes a feedback loop from the vestibular nucleus, the Purkinje cell, vestibular nucleus, sends back information to the vestibular nucleus. That's the simplest one. Dorsal and spinal cerebellar tracts carry information about unconscious proprioception from trunk and extremities. Dorsal spinal cerebellar stays ipsilateral, ventral goes contralateral, and then comes back ipsilateral. In essence, information coming from the trunk synapses with the Purkinje cell in the vermis, which makes contact with the vestigial nucleus. Vestigial nucleus that sends out axons to the reticular formation, activating the reticulospinal tract. And then the interposed nucleus sends out axons to the red nucleus, influences muscle tone, okay, and also sends out axons contralateral thalamus that then sends information up to the motor planning area of the brain. Okay, no difference. And then the cerebrocerebellum, thinking about moving, that's initiated in the motor planning area, sends out axons ipsilaterally to the pontine nuclei, send out axons through the middle cerebellar peduncle, again hook up with the Purkinje cell that's in the lateral hemisphere. That's hooked up to your dentate nucleus, sends out axons to the superior cerebellar peduncle through to the thalamus that relays that information back to the motor planning area. Yes? No? Horrible? I know. This says a lot of new words. Again, new words, but you can see how it's important to learn what we've learned thus far, right?